I love most when he tells me to turn to what we all call children's stories, and then he shows me what he's actually taught there. Because the funny thing is, nothing in the Bible was written for children specifically. In other words, when we teach children, every nursery on earth has at some point had a cute drawing of Noah's Ark on it. And yet, if you only ever see representations of that ark in children's toys, where it's a nice little squat boat, and the giraffe head is poking out of one little window, and the elephant is head poking out of the other, then you have no concept of the immensity of that ship. And so I hope some of you have had, and I think some of you have at this church, but if you haven't, I hope God affords you the chance to see what was done in Kentucky, if for no other reason than to pay your money to walk into that park and to look and say, wow, that's big. Because it wasn't a little squat boat, and there were no giraffes sticking their heads out of windows, because the boat was too big for that to be the case. And so things like that are amazing. The story of Noah's Ark and all that's there, it's not that it's not for children, but it's not a children's story. Moses and the burning bush, Moses parting the Red Sea. These are things, in fact, unless it's been years now, but I think Moses parting the Red, maybe it was painted on a wall here. Or the wall falling down at Jericho, all these different things. We teach them to children because they have ideas to put hooks into that they can remember. And one of the most famous, and it would have been famous in the Jewish world all throughout time, I promise you. One of the most famous is one of my most favorite, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. David and Goliath. Some of you might not even need that story told to you. I'm going to tell it anyway. But I want to make sure, first and foremost, though you know David and Goliath perhaps, though you know, yeah, that's in the Bible, but where? Well, let's be sure we know. So take your Bible that I hope you brought with you. If not, there's a pew Bible, I bet, right in front of you. I'm too forgetful to have, Jeanette, I didn't call myself dumb just then, but I was about to. I'm too forgetful to have looked to see what page it was, so I apologize, I can't tell you that. But it's 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17, we begin to hear the grand story of David and Goliath. And one of the things I love about looking at these children's stories is digging in deeper to see the details that the original hearers would know that I don't. You know, they're talking about where did this battle take place? Well, if somebody told me, I don't know how many of you are Blues fans. Just because you were born here doesn't mean you are one. But, you know, there's they don't even agree on this, Mason, but that's fine. I'm going to pretend like they do. There's a very, very famous crossroads in Clarksdale, Mississippi. And supposedly a young blues musician sold his very soul to the devil at the intersection of 61 and 49. I think the only problem is 61 and 49 intersect in more than one spot. Is that correct? Somehow I read that maybe it isn't here, but if it's not any different than it was way back then, there's actually a little posting of some guitars in Clarksdale that tells you, hey, here's where Robert Johnson supposedly traded his soul for the ability to play blues, right? And so if you're in the Delta or in the blues world, you've heard that story. And if I say the intersection of 49 and 61 in Clarksdale, if you're from around here, you can picture that spot, yes? You know where Clarksdale is, probably at least. And so you have a general idea. But when I get told where this story takes place in the Shephelah, in the Judean hills, where is that? What does that look like? What was that ground like? What does it matter to the story? I'm glad you asked, even though you didn't. You just thought it. Here's an interesting fact about David and Goliath. We're still talking about David, and we're still talking about Goliath. And the story from his youth is 3,000 years old. Now, I can't 100% remember what I ate for lunch yesterday. But we're still talking about something that occurred 3,000 years ago. Why is that an important thing? Because it's interesting to me. It must matter. You ever notice how easy it is to forget things that don't matter? Now, that could go two different ways, because sometimes we hold on to things that don't matter. But forgive me, sometimes my wife will tell me something, and then when it's about the time that something's supposed to take place, I'll act shocked, because I don't remember what we're doing. And she'll say, I told you. Well, I forgot. And the truth is I forgot, because when I was hearing about it, I was like, But David and Goliath, for 3,000 years, this story has been told. One of my favorite ways of ever hearing this story told wasn't a man reading me the Bible. It was Dr. Chuck Kelly, the former president of New Orleans Baptist Seminary, he was giving us a presentation, speaking a sermon. It wasn't a church service, and he talked about the importance of this story, and it made me incredibly interested in what there was to learn. Now, when you read through 1 Samuel 17, the Bible tells us that this takes place in a location known as the Shephelah. And the Shephelah was a valley. Jerusalem is basically up above everything else in Israel. That's why when you read in the New Testament, you'll always hear them saying that someone went up to Jerusalem, because you literally go up in altitude to get there. Well, from Jerusalem to the Mediterranean coast, the ground drops, and there's a valley area. This is the valley known as the Shephelah. This is the Judean foothills, they would have called this area. And this is where the Philistines and the armies of Saul have lined up against one another. Right? So we're not going to fight war the way war is fought today. We're not going to fight. The closest thing to the way they're about to fight this war that you and I might be familiar with is if you've ever watched the History Channel or old movies about the Revolutionary War, where they would literally march in groups up across from a field of one another. And in the Revolutionary time, they'd shoot a gun. But in David's time, they would march to a certain point, have a field across them, and then they'd shout at one another. My dad can beat up your dad. Oh yeah, well your mama's ugly. Whatever they would yell until they got mad enough that someone started running, and then they would charge and clash in the middle of the field. So that's where we find David even learning of the existence of Goliath, in the Shephelah, in the Judean foothills. Jesus would have called this place the Valley of Elah. The Valley of Elah. And what happens is a story that goes a little something like this. David is a shepherd boy. And a shepherd boy back then didn't have YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook. And so once a shepherd boy got done with all of his morning daily chores, if something exciting was going on near town, you went and checked it out. And so if the armies of Israel are about to start a fight with the Philistines, you're going to go look. And so David would finish his work, but then he would go over to the valley and he would sit and watch as they didn't fight. Now y'all went to high school, didn't you? And you remember there would always be some boys that needed to have some scuff. And somebody would say something, and everybody else in the class, no one would say, in the name of Jesus, I speak this evil out of this room and y'all need to behave. We would all go, ooh, because we wanted to see something happen. Well, David didn't have to say anything. He was just watching to see what's going to happen. Well, one of those days, his father, Jesse, says, look, boy, I know you're going to go over there, so your mama made some lunch for your brothers, because David's brothers were in this army. He said, I want you to take them this food. Next time you go out there, you're going to take them this food. And so, okay, Dad. David does what he's supposed to do. He takes what Mom had given him, and he goes to the location of the army, and he finds his brothers. And while he's there, he hears hollering from across the valley. And the specific hollering he hears is from this real strange-looking guy. And he's strange-looking because of how tall he is. Larger than every other man in that army across the field. And that man is cursing Yahweh. He is belittling Yahweh. He is mocking Yahweh. Now, in the 21st century, that happens a lot, and we do nothing. But in David's day, 3,000 years ago, he hears that mocking. He turns to these men who are armed with swords and armor and helmets, and he says, y'all just going to let him do that? You're just going to let that guy across that field holler like that and say those things about God? Say those things about the Almighty himself? You're just going to let him do it and get away with it? And their response is, yes. And so he says, man, I'd go over there and knock him out. Well, nobody likes a young person. I'm old enough to say this. When you're old, you don't like young people telling you what to do. You know, you ever notice it? Come on, be honest. I mean, what do you know? You're 13 years old. What do you know? Don't talk to me about saving money and paying bills. You know, whatever. And so they, shut up. That's what they tell David. Hush, be quiet. But Saul hears about this, the king, and he says, bring this kid to me. And so he does. And shortening some of that story, David agrees to enter into a historically known way of fighting a battle. Losing soldiers is expensive. Okay, damaging weapons, damaging armor, burying people, hauling the sick, treating the wounded, that's all very expensive. So one way that armies, generals, leaders would get past this is they would agree to a form of fighting called single combat, where you give your best guy, I give my best guy, the loser goes home. The winner wins. And David agrees to that form of single combat. Now, you don't have to answer out loud, but I'm going to probably be able to tell by your face. Is there any part of that story you don't know that I've told yet? Probably not. David's going to take a sling, isn't he? He's going to get a rock. He's going to beam that big man right in the forehead. Yeah? And thus, sometimes we say, ends the story of David and Goliath. Well, I want to just point out, the Bible tells me how tall Goliath is in cubits. When's the last time you measured something in cubits? Yeah? I want you to know how tall Goliath is. 6'9". Now, how many of you have ever heard that Goliath is 9 feet tall, 8 feet tall, 22 feet tall? 6'9". Now, to give you some sort of idea, I'm 6'2". So he's bigger than me, and a 6'9" man next to me, I'm going to be like, wow, that's a big man. But Goliath is around the height of a modern NBA basketball player. Okay? But during his lifetime, that was abnormally large. Like, stick out amongst a crowd, what's wrong with that man? Large. Because the average height during the time of Goliath was much shorter than it is today. He's wearing bronze armor. Now, I don't know a lot about this, but in history, there are metal ages. So you may remember learning in history class long ago about the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, stuff like that. Well, the Israelis were still existing technologically in what we would call the Copper Age. The majority of what they would have access to would be copper weapons. The Bible specifically tells us that Goliath is clad in solid bronze. His armor is bronze. His weapons are bronze. His helmet is bronze. Copper is copper. Bronze is copper and tin. And if I take my copper sword into a battle with your bronze sword, the problem is that when I hit you, my sword will bend. Not break, shatter, and fly off. It will bend over in half and become almost less than useless, a danger to me, while the pointy now all of a sudden is pointing at me. And so he's not just huge, he outclasses everyone. You know, if we had to, God forbid it, go to war with another country on this planet, one of the things that I at least draw some sense of comfort from for our soldiers is that we normally believe that we have superior technology. We have better weapons. But David and all these Israeli army soldiers are facing down the opposite. They have inferior stuff. He's huge. All of our stuff is tiny. And I just want to go home. All right, so how about that sling? You know, I hope, what a sling is. David being skilled with a sling makes him something called a slinger. But what matters is where he is. You know what gravel is. You know, we have a playground at our church, and it's got gravel in it. You know, you can buy gravel. And so sometimes people will look and say, listen, did this in a children's story. Take them outside of the playground, grab a handful in the playground and say, see, this David got rocks. Well, not those kind of rocks. Because here's something you and I definitely wouldn't know. In this region, all of the rocks are a specific mineral type. They're barite. Now, do you know what that means? Good, neither do I. I mean, they do. They have a son who's a geologist, so they might know. Okay? Specifically, these rocks are made up of what's known as barium sulfate. And barium sulfate makes a barite rock, and a barite rock is twice as dense as a normal rock. Baris, the Greek word baris, means heavy, which is why barite got its name, heavy rock. Because of the type of rock in this valley, when David bent down and picked up his 5 favorites, it was possible that leaving that sling, that rock traveled at 80 miles an hour. And at 80 miles an hour, a rock that is twice as dense as normal rocks, it is possible and been studied that hit Goliath's forehead with the velocity of a .45 caliber bullet. So you see, this isn't, I'm going to want you to think about it different. David shot him in the forehead. I had somebody make me a sling once. You can get hurt messing with that. Okay? And the reason I bring that up is because a little later. But I want to call attention to something David recognized about himself. And then I'm going to give you 2 points. I'm going to give you 2 hooks, I promise. But this stuff just amazes me. You mean to tell me that this shepherd boy bent down, and because of where God deemed this battle was going to take place, those rocks were twice as dense as rocks everywhere else, and that he was good enough with the sling to let it loose at 80 miles an hour, and thus the weight of the rock and the speed at which it transferred from one point to another was powerful enough to hit that man in the forehead like he had been shot with a .45 caliber gun? That's amazing to me. I mean, that's more than just a children's story. But something before that ever happens is really impressive. In chapter 17 and verse 38, somewhere around there, you know what, how about I just be, yeah, I was right. Verse 38, 39, Saul says, okay, you smart-mouthed kid, put on this armor and go out there and fight him. And so they put on armor. They give him a sword. He gets dressed up like a soldier. And David says, I can't wear this because I have not tested it. I have not been tested in it. David knew his capability. And he knew it didn't involve all that stuff. Sometimes we get stuck not realizing what we can and can't do. The older I get, the more I'm learning lessons that many of you probably already know, which is sometimes my mind says something is possible, and my body says, try it, fat boy. You know, it's not going to happen. I used to be able to run, skip, jump, do tumbling tricks and all this stuff, and now I'm old enough. I know 44, again, maybe not the oldest man in the room, but 44 has gotten me to the point where I'm like, I must have brushed my teeth too hard last night because my elbow hurts. You know, it's weird things like that. You have to know your limitations, and David tells Saul, I can't wear this. I haven't been tested in it. I don't know what to do with it. But I do know what I know what to do with. But anyway, that was an aside. That was a slight rabbit hunt. I want to give you 2 ironclad lessons that children don't take from this story. Number 1, I need you to know that giants in your life are never what they seem. To the Hebrew people, Goliath was the strongest, biggest, most powerful, most dangerous thing they had ever seen. And so they trembled and they were afraid. But let me tell you a little about Goliath. First off, Goliath is an anomaly, meaning he ain't normal. But when I say he isn't normal, most likely Goliath actually has a tumor on his pituitary gland. Now you think, hey, you're digging a little bit. No. Medically, there is a disease, a deformity caused by a tumor on your pituitary gland called acromegalia. Did I say that right, Jimmy? Acromegalia, close enough. See, hey, you wouldn't know, would you? Acromegalia. It's a deformity, a growth deformity. You've known people like this. Abraham Lincoln most likely had this problem. Andre the Giant, any WWF, way back in the day, wrestling fans, Andre the Giant had this diagnosis. Now, was Andre the Giant a gigantically large and huge man? Yes, he was. And did he pretend to be overly strong and capable on the TV when I was a kid? Yes. But in an actual battle, Andre the Giant would have been largely useless because of multiple things, such as having extremely poor eyesight. This tumor on your pituitary gland causes an overproduction of your growth hormone. So you grow rapidly, you grow a long time, and you rarely see a case in where the growth stops, creating the anomaly of a 6'9" gigantic looking man. But Goliath can't see. He looks like how some of you feel like you look when you wake up in the morning before you put your glasses on. How do I know this? Because the Bible tells me that Goliath, specifically the word is led by an attendant. It isn't somebody going out in front of him, it's somebody directing him to where to go, because he can't see well enough to get there on his own. How else do I know that? Because of his need to be led, I immediately know he is an unsteady man. Now, if I prop up a gigantic, a huge looking guy at the door, I might scare off people from trying to come in. But if they know that all they have to do is blow in his direction and he'll fall over because he has poor balance because of a deformity of his growth, they wouldn't be so scared, would they? Because a giant isn't what it seems to be. What other evidence is there that this is true? Well, Goliath tells David. Okay, so let's actually, this might be one of those messages where you think, well, he hasn't actually read from the Bible yet, and I hope that doesn't bother you. But look with me in 1 Samuel 17. Look at verse 41. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. That's the guy who's leading him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him because he was a youth. He was ruddy, young, and handsome. Why would Goliath, this giant man of a man, care that David was good looking? Is it possible that the closer you get to the Goliath, the more you see he's not what you think he is? And that he's not handsome, that he suffers from deformity, that he's not the giant they feared. And the Philistine says in verse 14, "Come to me." Well, in Hebrew it says, "Come closer." I can't see him, so I command him to come closer, you see? And the Bible tells us that when David approached Goliath in the first place, he took 1 stick and 5 stones. But when he gets near Goliath, Goliath says to him, "You come at me with sticks," plural. Because if a man is holding 1 stick and you have double vision, how many sticks are there? It's the exact same reason when you get a bonk on the head, a doctor or a nurse or somebody who loves you comes up and says, "How many fingers am I holding up?" Because if your vision is doubled or blurry, you see more than the ones they're holding there. Goliath, by the evidence scripturally and the history that we know, he can't see well. Well, suddenly I begin to think that maybe fighting this guy might not be so hard. Because if he can't see me, if he's overly large, how many of you remember growing up and going through this treacherous time period called puberty? And you would grow up and somehow, growing a ½ inch messed everything up about how you experience the world. You know, you don't think about this, but my mind, my brain knows how long my arm is. And so without consciously worrying about it, I could just reach out and grab this microphone. Because my arm has been the same length for a long time, and I'm used to doing that without even having to mentally exercise. But then you go through puberty, and your arm's, I guess, a ½ inch long, and you're like, remember being clumsy? You know, teenagers are clumsy. Teenagers fall over themselves. Imagine growing your whole life and never settling on a certain size. Goliath is clumsy. Goliath has to be led. Goliath is a showpiece. He's there in your face to frighten you. But on the actual reality of him, he's nothing to fear. Just like every giant in your life. Every problem that haunts you and keeps you up at night, or the things you think of the first moment you open your eyes, every giant that you deal with, I'm telling you, thanks to Jesus Christ, that giant is not what you think it is. That giant is not the thing you think it is to fear. Because the Bible tells you that there's not a single thing formed against you that can win. There's nothing that can be done, nothing said, nothing acted upon, nothing withheld, nothing orchestrated that can stop what God does through you. You cannot be paused. But the devil wants you to believe otherwise, doesn't he? And so somebody will say something, someone will do something, some giant will be wheeled out. That's what I imagine. I know it's not like that, but I don't know why this came when I was a child, and I don't know why, but I always imagined Goliath standing on some sort of a wagon, and they just pull him out, and he's like, kind of wobbling, and they get him in his spot, and then he starts cursing, and everybody's like, oh, and then when they're done with that for the day, and they wheel him back out. Maybe the David and Goliath stage play, that's what you could do. That's how you could get him in and out. But he's not what everyone else fears. David is going to learn that best because he wasn't afraid to get close to it. But some of us can't know that there's nothing to fear because we're running from this giant. Now, a much smarter American than me said there's nothing to fear except fear itself. And then a science fiction writer wrote a book called Dune. And in the book Dune, this character has to stick his hand in a box. And the box has nothing in it. But he begins to think that his hand is burning and hurting, and he's feeling pain, and he's all worried. And this creepy old lady in the book says, take your hand out of the box. And when he snatches it back, he expects to see his mangled hand and all this terribleness, and there's nothing there. Fear is the mind killer, he had said to himself. Fear is the mind killer. The devil can't touch you. Now, I know, theologically, your brain maybe is like, no, he can, yes, he can. He can touch this, but he can't touch me. Jesus said, everyone that my Father gave me, they're in my hand, and no one can snatch them out of it. Can he cause me to stumble? Can he make people cut at my flesh, cut at my emotion? Of course. And then even, let me just give you another little side. It's not the devil doing that. It's people deciding to do it on behalf of the encouragement of the devil. I'll say that one more time. It's not the devil who's doing whatever it is that's happening. It's people doing the encouraging thing that the devil has told them to do that's cutting at you, hurting at you, pulling at you, taking at you. My father told me a story one time about how he was a bad kid, by the way, which is all the more amazing how good of a man I have become. But my dad wanted to make mud pies when he was young, and he decided that the best firewood in the house was one of his mother's dining room chairs. And so he chopped that chair up, and he set it on fire, and he made mud pies. First, what is the point of a mud pie? I don't know. You don't eat that, do you? That's disgusting. If you do, don't tell me. But when approached by his father, in hopes of avoiding the punishment to come, what were you thinking? May have been something my father was asked. And he said, and I quote on his own testimony, the devil made me do it. I need you to listen real close. There might be somebody in here that believes that's true. The devil never made anybody do anything. Starting at Eve and ending whenever Jesus comes back, we choose to do it. We choose our behaviors, our actions. And without a closer inspection at what that giant actually was, those men chose to allow God to be cursed, assaulted, insulted, and belittled because they were afraid. Think about it. In the Garden of Eden, did the devil shove that fruit, whatever it was? I know you and I, we all probably picture an apple. It wasn't an apple. I don't know that. Did the devil shove it in her mouth? Nope. All he did was ask her to question what God said. Because, and I quote, did God really say? And in fact, if you go look there in Genesis chapter 3, you'll notice that Eve misquotes God. And heaven forgive if that's not a huge problem today. But anyway, I don't think children get that. But the story of David and Goliath is included here to teach us that giants are never what they seem. Giants are never what they seem. And this giant that we know, Goliath, 6'9", an anomaly in himself, he has most likely a disease. They wouldn't have called it this. They didn't have a name like that back then. But he has, I have to look at it every time, acromegalia. Acromegaly. Acromegaly. Jenny was too nice to tell me I was saying it wrong that first time. Acromegaly, which is a tumor on his pituitary gland. It's causing him to grow his whole life. Just grow, grow, grow. Not like, well, today I'm another foot taller and tomorrow I'll be another. Not like that, but incrementally, slowly, constantly growing. Causing him to be perpetually clumsy. Causing him to have double vision, if not what we would refer to as being legally blind. Not being able to get around by himself. Not being able to see clearly. Not being able to function normally. Because everything that the devil throws in your face is a cheap imitation at best. Which leads me to the second hook I'd like you to have in this story. Every one of you in here needs to realize you have a sling in your pocket at all times. The story of David and Goliath tells us that David was a slinger. And that means that in his hand, I told you, I mentioned it in passing, but I had somebody make me a sling, and you can hurt yourself. It didn't even have a rock in it. I just wanted to see what it was like to spin it really fast, and you got to hold on to one strip of the sling, but let the other one go so that it opens at the right. I whacked myself in the eye with it. I'm like, I was so excited because if you get it going real fast, it starts going. I'm like, ooh, I'm like David, and I tried to let that piece go, and it flapped around, and hit me right in the face, because I don't know what I'm doing. But in the hands of David, that strap of leather with a pouch in the middle was literally a superior weapon to everything else on the field that day. Why? The sling I have, the strings are not leather. Somebody at church has a fancy one. But it's designed literally, historically, my little sling, exactly in a way that historically it would have been for David. It's not an overly complex thing. So why could he shoot a man in the head and I almost blinded myself in one eye? What's the difference? Practice, experience, and familiarity. You want to be great in the kingdom of God? How does Jesus say to get there? The back of the line. The greatest in my kingdom are the least. Well, if we all know that and love Jesus, why are we always clawing our way to the front? Why are we always fighting to be seen, fighting to be heard, fighting to be first? Jesus said the great ones in my kingdom are in the back. And if you want to be served in my kingdom, you achieve that by being servant of all. And he took that one so far as to prove it by serving me on the cross. But you want to be grand as a prayer warrior? You got to practice prayer. You got to become excellent in prayer. You got to become familiar in prayer. Every time that God has blessed me to speak with people, I shouldn't say every time. Let me rephrase that. Rewind. On occasion is better. Someone has come up to me and said, "Boy, I really appreciate what you just said." "Oh, I'm very grateful for that. Thank you." I'm not really good at compliments, but I have learned to say thank you. And then they'll say, a couple of times, somebody said, "I wish I could do what you do." And it always reminds me of a story I read. You never know what's a preachery story or a real story, but it's about this famous cellist. His name doesn't matter. And he played a cello concert at a church. And if you know anything about a cello, I would trade every vocal talent God ever gave me. I know you're not supposed to do that, but if he would let me, I'd trade my vocal talent to be able to play the cello, even mediocrely. I love the sound of a cello. It's like a giant violin on steroids. You got to sit down to play it in between your legs. It's so deep and rich. Oh, I love it. Well, he plays this beautiful, wonderful cello concert for the church. Everyone loves it. Everyone's blessed. And like a good churchman, he goes to the door and waits for people to leave so he can say, "Thank you, thank you. Oh, thank you for coming. I appreciate you all that." And a woman walks up to him and says, "That was the most beautiful concert I've ever heard in my life." He said, "I'm so thankful you were here." She said, "I'd give my whole life to be able to play like you do." He said, "That's funny, I did." Because he had practiced his whole life to be able to play like that. I need to know that you heard me tell you, there is no finish line in the church. There is no moment in which you say, "I've finally arrived. I've learned it all, I know it all, I've got it all, and I can do it all." You're done when you meet him face to face. Until then, you have somewhere to go. And so we continually are called to practice with the sling that's in our pocket. He's given you a weapon, whether that weapon is You feel comfortable saying your weapon is prayer. You're comfortable saying my weapon is the Lord himself. You're comfortable realizing that whatever my weapon is or defined as, it doesn't matter because no other weapon that's been formed on earth can defeat me. Whatever makes you feel strength, you need to find it, dig into it, and practice with it. Because that's what made David so successful. Do you think for a moment that that shot he hit Goliath with was the first time he had ever used that sling? No, every time, the hundreds of times that he used that sling to protect his father's flock, every rock he flung was in preparation for that one. He had a sling, but he knew what to do with it. What is your sling? Now, can I just make sure, before I answer that question, can I just make sure that you know exactly how the story of David and Goliath ends? The end is a little gruesome, so I understand why we don't tell it to kids. Normally, we say David goes out there, sees Goliath, gets the rock, hits him in the head, the guy falls over, the end. Let's go get a cookie and a Kool-Aid. First off, David didn't shoot him from a distance. The Bible says that when he took that rock and began to prepare his sling, he ran at Goliath. He took off towards that thing. Because he didn't fear that thing, because Satan's a liar. And when he loosed that rock and it sinks into Goliath's forehead, the Bible tells us that Goliath falls over flat. If you got shot in the head, same thing happened to you. Is that it? No. Then the Bible says David steps up on top of Goliath, picks up Goliath's own sword, and decapitates Goliath right there. The end of the story isn't that David won, it's that David proved there was never a battle. And he picks up that head and he shows it to the Philistines. And I don't know that this is Mason's translation and understanding of the Bible, but I'm convinced because David was a young man, his eyes looked at every Philistine soldier, and unspoken, but on everybody's mind was David saying to them, anybody else? We don't know, but it is understood because of Goliath's preparation that many times he would have been trotted out and that the opposing army would have surrendered immediately because they were too scared to get close. David proved to them false because he had a sling. That sling had been given to that boy, and his journey had been planned not by Jesse, not by his brothers, but by his Father in heaven. Now, I mentioned already, but what are some of your slings? Maybe your sling is your prayer life. You've heard people referred to as prayer warriors. We need more people to hold that title. I need somebody that will sweat for me. Jesus prayed, and under such duress in the Garden of Gethsemane, he didn't just sweat, he bled sweat. I don't even know what that looks like, and I don't really want to know. But I need somebody to drop a few drops of sweat on my behalf just to survive. To know that there are people who pray that when I stand up like this, I can get done what God tells me to get done. But maybe you have a sling that you have forgotten how to use. It's called your testimony. Now, that's a word that's fallen out of fashion because it's 2022 and not 22. But I want you to understand, I literally just shared this with somebody today. I'm so thankful he always knits things together for me because I got a bad memory. I don't know the name of the art form. I'm forgetful there. But in Japan, the majority of their art is connected with a philosophy. So how they do one thing or another is connected with how they see the world or how they understand. And I don't know the name of the art form. Brother Steve will have to look that up for y'all and fill in that gap. But if I'm saying it correctly, the result of it and the philosophy is called wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi. And without knowing, you've probably seen this before. If you've ever seen a piece of ceramic or pottery of any kind that has cracks in it, but those cracks have been filled with a gold-leafed glue. Well, that comes from a Japanese philosophy that says you don't hide flaws, you use them to strengthen the whole. And so they'll take pottery, break it on purpose, and then use this, not just regular old Elmer's glue, they'll take this special type of glue, cement, whatever they prepare, and they'll put literal gold in it, And then they'll paint those cracks and put that thing back together. And then that thing is stronger where those cracks are than anywhere else, thus signifying that through your wound, you are made stronger than if you had never been broken. Well, every one of our testimonies is some sort of wound where Jesus found you in the dirt. I told you at the beginning of our time together days ago, however many it was, you didn't stumble across him. Somebody brought you to him. Somebody shared Jesus with you. They gave you their testimony. Somehow, some way. Was it the way they spoke to you? Was it the life they lived in front of you? I meet wonderful people that inspired me and my wife from this church. And I don't mean to single anybody out and make anybody else feel bad, but there was few people I wanted to be more like than Leo Scruggs. Because he knew how to keep his mouth closed, and I still don't. And I asked Miss Judy, God bless her. I asked Miss Judy one Wednesday night. Leo was in the choir, and she always patiently waited for me to finish in the live. Because, again, I don't know how to shut my mouth, so choir practice around here ran a little long. And so she'd be waiting in the library for him. And she worked in there. And so I said, Miss Judy, I have a question. I just am inspired by Mr. Leo. How is he the way he is? Now I'm ready for an information dump from Judy, you know. I'm ready for her to just throw it on me. And you know, I mean, I need chapter, verse, which other books to read to be like Leo Scruggs. I think she's going to tell me, and she says, baby, ask him. Why did she tell me that? Because that was his story. That was his testimony. And whether he would ever have known it or not, at least to one guy, he was telling it without a word. Your testimony is your sling. Your prayer life is your sling. You know what else? Your service in the world is your sling. It is easy and pointless to wag your fingers, shake your head, and talk about how bad the world is. David could have sat on the hill and said to himself, man, they're going to let that guy cuss God like that? That's a shame. I got to go home. But instead, he knew that he needed to do something, to act. We were called to be active. We were called to be moving. We were called to be a force in the world. And it's a reference I already gave you early on, but how do I know this? Because Jesus told Peter and the disciples in Matthew chapter 16, the gates of hell will not prevail against the faith that will be established on this earth. Well, gates don't attack people. People attack gates. And so if the gates of hell be busted down, then it's me with the power of Christ on my side who takes the fight to the gate, which means I serve Jesus in the world around me, who, by the way, is ultimately the sling. You have Jesus in your pocket. You cannot go anywhere where he is not. I asked this of the Father. He said, where can I go? Where can I go that you're not there? I could go to the tallest mountain. I could go to the deepest bottom. I could go far and wide, and yet there you are. When you tell children about Jonah and the great big fish, there's a reason he set sail for the region he set sail to. Because it was the furthest location that they sailed, and he thought he would be able to get out of God's eyesight. Well, thanks be to the complete testimony of Scripture, you and I have the privilege of knowing the truth. You can't go nowhere. He sees. He knows. Take him with you as well. Charles Sheldon, is it Charles Sheldon? In the 1800s wrote a book called In His Steps. Participatory. Read In His Steps? 1, 2, 3. Okay, good. Anybody heard the phrase, what would Jesus do? That's where it came from. It came from a story, a fiction story, about a group of people who purposed in their church and their life together to do nothing, not just a complicated decision, any decision at all, not to do what they think they should do until they first ask, what would Jesus do? And when they answered that question, that's what they would do in that decision. Do I buy the Kenmore or the Whirlpool? I don't know. What would Jesus do? When I was young, I used to think that was a stupid question. I thought God is too big to care which washing machine I buy. I learned I was very wrong. God cares about the way you breathe. God cares about the way you think, what you hear, when you blink. He cares about your toenails. That might seem silly, but you ever had an ingrown one? He cares. And he knows that the only real hurt you ever have had is death. So Jesus. You might watch this thing in front of you drop dead tomorrow. I don't know it. But I need you to know in the clarity of your heart that if I were to die in front of you and you could see my soul, I'd be like this. Because this isn't something to worry over. This is. Someone smart wrote and said the distance between heaven and hell is 18 inches. 18 inches. What? Oh, yeah, he's like, is this? Is it my foot? What's 18 inches? From the man's brain to the man's heart, on average, is a distance of 18 inches. And too many of us know him and don't know him. So there's the road there's a journey I have to take, the road I have to go down. And there's going to be giants pop out of the wood. You know, remember The Wizard of Oz? And I'm looking at the clock. I don't want y'all to get mad. Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. You remember that? Okay. And they were afraid. And even the trees started snatching them up. Well, in your life, you're going through the world, and there's things jumping out at you. There's things calling attention. There's things pulling at you. Well, they were afraid because they had no defense. She had a brainless scarecrow, heartless tin man, and a cowardly lion. I'm walking through the woods with the King of Kings. I'm walking through the woods with the wonderful counselor. I'm walking through the woods with the one who, when he opens his mouth, the only way that John knew how to describe it in Revelation is that a sword came out of it. Now, personally, I don't think that's how it works, because that's freaky. But what does John mean? That just by saying, he can cut you down. And he's on my side. I'm sorry. But that makes me walk around my chest poked out a little bit. Not because I'm any big deal, but because my dad can beat up yours. He's my slave. But I got to know him. I have to know him. I don't even know about him. Who's the first president of the United States? You know. You just know that fact, but you don't know George Washington. Well, you ask me, who's the King of Kings? I know. And I know him. I know what makes him happy. I know what disappoints him. I know what brings him joy. I know what he does. I know what he says to hate. I know the things he tells me to avoid. I know him. And I know that he knows me. I am the good shepherd. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them. Just like I told you in Matthew 7, I will say, depart from me, you worker of iniquity. I do not know you. In your heart, do you know Jesus, and are you certain that he knows you? Do you hear him speak so that when you see giants all around you, you realize that's not what I think it is? Like a hall of mirrors or a haunted house, it's there to frighten me, to deter me, to put me off the right track, but it ain't real. What's real is the throne of God, the peals of lightning and thunder, and the word that cuts sharper than any sword, splitting bone and marrow and piercing your very soul. I'm not afraid of giants. I'm afraid of him. And I love him for it, because he loves me. And he loves you. So there's a children's story. Rocks as heavy as bullets. A mutant type of man who wasn't anything to fear at all. And the truth that giants are never what they seem. And you have a sling. So I want you to go fight. I want you to not literally throw rocks at people. But I want you to learn how to use your sling. I want you to learn how to apply Jesus over your life. And that comes from here, from here, from here, where the King resides and chooses to dwell.
Amen. I want to tell you about Jerry Altman. He was a friend from seminary. He's one of the great instrumentalists in our Southern Baptist Convention. He plays, for years, he's played the organ at First Baptist Church in Dallas. But about 40 years ago, I invited him to play music and lead the music at a revival. He had played at our wedding and it went real good. Invited him to revival. And he was playing. He was kind of like Don. He was playing and turning pages and scratching his nose and carrying on a conversation with me all at once. And I was impressed with that. I'm not a piano player, but that was impressive. And so we were talking, and I said, I sure wish I could play like that. And he said, no, you don't. Okay. I thought I did. He said, if you did, you'd practice. And he was right. If you want to carry your sling, you're going to have to practice. You're going to have to live the Christian life, the biblical Christian life, not some interpretation of somebody, not what's politically correct interpretation, not what makes you feel good. You got to live by the Bible, the sling God has given you. You got to pray biblically. You got to share your testimony biblically. You got to be that Christian that God says to be. And then, maybe down the road, you'll be one of the outstanding Christians in the kingdom of God. It starts tonight. When you say, I'm going to do that. I'm going to start living my life more for Jesus. Will you make that commitment to Jesus tonight?
Not the